Salamanders Epistolary Zabari watched a forest of exhaust stacks at the Gamma 3 refinery explode, the flames glowing bright against the dark sky. In fact, all of Feldrus burned. The industrial planet was in the grips of a full-scale revolt. Cities were aflame, lighting the polluted night sky a dull orange as if the heavens themselves smouldered. The populace had risen up by the thousands. Cultists and traitor defence units threw themselves at the ruling dynasty's forces. The Salamanders had hastened to Feldros as soon as the planet's terrified plea for aid was sifted from the churning warp. The world fulfilled the subsector's highest tithe of munitions and promethium, and the planet's return to full production was vital to the supply of Indomindus Crusade battle groups sweeping through the region. The heat wash from the burning refinery was blistering, and it brought the reek of scorched metal and pollutants as another burst of autogun fire patterned against the librarian's draconic green and midnight blue plate. While his brothers fought in other war zones, Epistolary Zabari led his compact force through a smoke-filled warren of alleys behind the Gamma 3 refinery. The thunder of shotgun and the crack-a-las carbines, fired by ragged bands of traitors, dogged their every step. Workers, enforcers, traitors, yes, but not warriors, Zabari reminded himself. They are flaws and impurities to be burned away, and I seek to scour the greatest impurity of all. Idolatrous images and runes of the dark gods were worn brazenly on defaced uniforms, held aloft on black banners, or even carved into the flesh of frenzied cultists. Stories whispered by harrowed frontline survivors even told of witches and sorcerers, shadow men casting black fire, and terror rites shaping killing curses. The planet's rulers dismissed such talk and branded its repetition as treachery. Nevertheless, such frightened tales continued, and their flames were fanned with every new insurrection. The Salamanders had witnessed such unnatural powers too. Zabari understood what the nobility of Feldros could never, should never know. The Epistolary had fought against worshippers of the dark gods on scores of worlds, and had seen sorcerers strip flesh, overturn tanks, and tear open the fragile barrier keeping the warp at bay. As a librarian, Zabari knew where such power came from. He could recognise its evil spore and track it down. There was sorcery on Feldros, and he meant to extinguish it. The strongest trail had led Zabari here, and, with 2 squads from the 3rd Company, he pushed through a maze of jumbled buildings. "We are nearing the source of the empiric emanation, Sergeant. I can feel it," he told the large warrior standing alongside him. Beside Zabari, Sergeant Cavall cracked the thin plascrete roadway with each heavy tread of his Mark 10 Gravis armour. Cavall's squads of aggressors weathered a hail of shots. The foetid township they pushed through sprawled at the refinery's edges. They conserved the fuel of their flame-storm gauntlets, unleashing incendiary bursts only against large mobs that tore towards them. Otherwise, the aggressors crushed the cultists with blows from their enormous power fists. Broken bodies were sent flying from savage backhand swings, while others were smashed to pulp beneath pile-driving punches. Zabari swung his Cupric-chased force axe in wide arcs. He fed only a portion of his psychic might into the psycho-crystalline matrix within the weapon. Most of his attention was focused on divining the nebulous thread of what Zabari thought of as Mindfire, the corrupted pulsing energy that spoke of a psyker alloyed with the unclean powers. It was diffuse and shifting, like greasy smoke, but Zabari knew they were getting closer. Another Salamander's squad fought in the narrow alleyways to Zabari's right. Deafening noise and actinic glares mixed with the amplified roars, terrified screams were suddenly silenced. Sergeant Jur's Reavers savaged cultists attempting to outflank the Salamanders, protecting their less manoeuvrable brothers. The Reavers' combat knives glinting with a bronze sheen, slashed and decapitated. Their efficiency was terrifying, and before the Reavers' skull-like faceplates and ruddy eye lenses, the cultists fled in panic. "There!" Zabari snapped with a gasp as they came in sight of a circular fortified building. "Straight ahead, Sergeant. 5-point incineration," he told Cavall before he switched Vox channels. "Sergeant Jur, converge on our position. Compound breach imminent. Initiate rearguard, pattern Voltus Sigma, then follow us in," commanded the librarian. Zubari guessed the building was the township's enforcer precinct house, although any signifiers had been burned away and replaced with offensive scrawls. A desultory hail of small arms fire sprayed from inside. Zubari was surer with every step he took that who he searched for hid within. Duer's Reavers tore apart the cultists who tried to stop the Salamanders as they reached the precinct house, before following Zubari's coded instruction. As one, 5 adamantine grapnels launched skywards, and the Reavers swiftly scaled the building's walls. Caval's aggressors poured sheets of burning promethium towards the firing slits. They were rewarded with shrieks that then stifled as burning air entered the guards' lungs. Zubari forged his will into a shimmering ball of flame before launching it forward with a sudden thrust of his armoured gauntlet towards the reinforced door. The psychic fireball exploded, vaporizing the plasteel and shattering the surrounding stanchions. Epistolary Zubari led the aggressors forward. Shimmering globules of liquid metal dripped as they crossed the threshold. As Zubari stepped inside, his auto-senses adjusted to the contrasting gloom and guttering flame still burning from the aggressors' attacks. The building was a charnel house. Sprays of gore and runnels of old blood splattered every surface. The guards' burning bodies could not cover the stench of human waste, sweat and blood. Barred cells ringed the curved perimeter, dozens more on the floor above. Inside each, Zubari saw slumped people. They were barely alive. Within each, the librarian sensed a spark of psychic potential, but Zubari barely spared a thought for them. The small crowd at the precinct house's centre bound his attention, and now he understood why the spore of sorcery had seemed nebulous. Almost 50 people stood crowded together. They stared at the Salamanders, many in fear and some weeping. They seemed drawn from every aspect of Feldrossi society. There were strongly built labourers who might have been refinery workers. Elderly nobles from the capital stood with stick-thin urchins wearing haggard faces, and others in the faded uniforms of Feldrossi riflemen. On the floor at their feet rested the remains of a man. His bones were broken, his skin bruised and richly scarred. The man's head had been ripped apart in bloody chunks, but Zubari recognised the sunken eye sockets of an astropath. "You are not permitted here," the crowd said. Everyone at once had spoken, almost at once, as if each read from a single script. None shouted, and many voices were hoarse or shrill with fear, but the collective voice was loud. From behind them, an enforcer took 2 steps, idly kicking the astropath's broken legs away from him. No one else moved, but several in the crowd looked at the enforcer nervously and expectantly. Zubari felt the heat of the Mindfire radiating off each person in the crowd, but none more so than the enforcer. The lawman acting as some kind of nexus for their power. It was a ferocious blaze that burned and consumed. Now he understood the psykers in the cells. The corrupted astropath, the enforcer, and this crowd were gorging on them, draining the prisoners to fill their ever-emptying void in themselves. This crowd of psykers were not prisoners, but Zubari saw they were equally enthralled to the enforcer. At least, their bodies were. Their eyes betrayed each individual's terror and guilt. The lawman swaggered in pristine carapace armour, a green manticle flecked with blood swathing his shoulders. Zubari's eyes narrowed as he recognised it as an astropath's robes, now worn like a trophy. "The penalty for trespassing is death," said the crowd. The enforcer gazed hungrily at the librarian, but kept the crowd between himself and the Salamanders. "As is the penalty for betraying the Emperor," replied Zubari, raising his bolt pistol and firing. The shell detonated before it reached the enforcer, and now the lawman wheeled his thralls to attack. Bolts of sizzling purple lightning flew from outstretched hands. Tear-streaked faces wailed, and empiric amplification turned the screams into psychosonic screeches. Black streams of fire spat from the thralls' wide eyes. Every one of the crowd drew upon their dangerous powers, and coruscating energy arced towards the Salamanders. Zubari fought against every warp-forged attack with iron-hard mental discipline. He bled the power from furious bolts and dove into his opponent's minds to destroy curses even as they formed. He could not stop them all, and 2 aggressors fell, their armour melted, ruptured or hideously altered. Koval's surviving aggressors unleashed their full volcanic fury on the Thrall psykers. Torrents of burning promethium roared out and billowed over an invisible barrier that steamed and hissed. Zubari could see the Enforcer beyond the flames, both hands held before him, his face twisted in a snarl as he held back the flames' heat. Warp frost wreathed his form as he projected a billowing gale of icy wind before him. Other thralls added blasts of kinetic energy to the defence, keeping the Salamander's fiery attacks at bay. Zubari backed towards the door and slammed his hands on either side of the broken doorway. With a crack, a splitting line of fire, soot and lightning leapt from each hand and tore its way around the curving inner wall on either side. They bypassed the desperate warding shields thrown forward by the psykers. When 2 arcing lines of power met, they exploded in flame and ash. Cyrort fire engulfed many of the thralls. Those not killed instantly beat at the flames that refused to go out. Their mouths gaped wide, but none screamed, and Zubari at least saw the full power the Enforcer held over them. These Thrall psykers were pawns. Though the librarian regretted each of their deaths, he knew there was no safe way to let them live. Many thralls yet survived, manifesting attacks with greater desperation. Over the tumult of psychic power and roaring flames, the shattering of glass from above was almost lost. The shards fell over the Astropath's corpse, and Jur's Reavers landed with crushing force in the thrall's midst. "The Enforcer!" shouted Zubari into the Vox. "Kill him now!" 5 bolt shells punched into bodies that suddenly dove between the Reavers and the Enforcer. The psychic dominator threw his thralls' lives away to shield them, and more died in every moment. "Die, filth!" said the psykers, their weakened voice drawn from terrified and exhausted survivors. Several threw themselves at the Reavers, maniac fear in their eyes as the Enforcer compelled them while he backed further away. The Enforcer thrust one hand towards Jur's squad while keeping his gaze fixed on the aggressors. One of Jur's Reavers jerked and fell as his finely wrought armour crumpled and crushed him. With few psychic attacks to disperse now, Zubari ran forwards, his mind cleaving a path through the lawman's psychic storm. The librarian leapt for the Enforcer, bearing him to the ground and breaking the man's ribs beneath his weight. He pressed his hands on the man's breastplate and poured his anger into the psychic puppeteer. The man thrashed and screamed as psychic fire first melted the armour onto his skin and then incinerated him from the inside. From his open mouth, flame jetted in a gale, playing harmlessly over Zubari's nocturne forged ceramite. With the Enforcer's death, the remaining Thrall psykers died quickly. Smoke trailed up through the broken roof from their bodies. Zubari took a breath and nodded to Koval and Jur. The roar of flame and the muffled bark of silenced bolts began as the 2 squads steadily made their way from cell to cell. Zubari cast his gaze and his mind around the prison. "How was this possible?" he questioned, looking at the Enforcer's empty, charred armour. "There were so many psykers here, and many were old. How have the Black Ships missed this potential for so long?" Zubari felt a familiar heat begin to build, the tingle of Mindfire. Not here, but it wasn't far. Koval and Jur approached, silently confirming their task was complete with curt nods. "I fear these are not the last brothers," Zubari told them. "There was never going to be only one, but I did not expect so many." "The fires of battle ever temper us," replied Koval stoically. Zubari nodded. "That they do, brother. That they do."